For 2 decades, James lived with the ghost of the story his father told him. A tragic camping trip, a sudden argument, and a mother who walked into the woods and never returned. The official report called it a voluntary disappearance, leaving a young boy with a lifetime of questions. But when a historic flood churns the city's underbelly, a single piece of plastic emerges from a storm drain miles from that lake. His mother's nursing ID, perfectly preserved, a relic that has no business being there. For James, it's not just a clue. It's an accusation that has been waiting 20 years to be heard. What you're about to hear is a story of how one small, forgotten object can unravel a generation of lies. Stick with me as we follow this thread and uncover a truth that was buried deeper than any storm drain. James worked as an archivist at the city library, a profession that suited him perfectly. He spent his days in the quiet company of the past, organizing other people's stories into neat, logical order. It was a comfort, a way of creating the certainty his own life had always lacked. His personal history had one giant, gaping hole in it, a chapter that ended abruptly in the summer of 1992 when he was just 10 years old. His mother, Jean, had vanished. The official story, the one his father, Donald, recited with a practiced weariness, was simple and clean. They had gone camping at Pinecrest Lake, 100 miles north of the city. They had an argument. She went for a walk to cool off and never came back. The police searched for weeks, but the dense woods kept their secrets. With no body and no evidence of foul play, the case was eventually closed, filed away under voluntary disappearance. James grew up in the shadow of that filing cabinet, a boy raised by a quiet, hollowed-out man who never spoke of his wife again. The call came on a Tuesday morning, a day that had started as uneventfully as any other. The voice on the other end was a Detective Donna, a name he didn't know. She said she was with the cold case unit. The words sent a strange, cold jolt through him. "We found something," the detective said, her voice professional but not unkind. "Something belonging to your mother, Jean." James's knuckles went white as he gripped the phone. For a moment, he thought he was going to be sick. He imagined them finding bones, a final, grim confirmation. But what the detective said next made no sense. A CityWorks crew found her hospital ID badge. It was lodged in a storm drain on the east side near the old warehouse district. The recent flooding seems to have dislodged it. James was silent, his mind struggling to connect the pieces. The warehouse district? That was miles from their old home, and a world away from Pinecrest Lake. Why would his mother's ID be there? "Are you sure it's hers?" he finally managed to ask. "The photo matches, and the name is Jean Sanders." "We believe so. We were hoping you could come down to the station to formally identify it." James agreed, his voice a hoarse whisper. After he hung up, he stood motionless in his small apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. The story he had been told for 20 years, the one that had formed the foundation of his grief, suddenly had a crack running right through it. An ID badge in a storm drain wasn't the final piece of a tragic puzzle. It was the first piece of a different one entirely. A flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope, but a sharp, demanding curiosity lit up inside him. He had to know, and he knew there was only one person to ask. The drive to his father's house felt longer than usual. Donald lived in the same small house they had shared as a family, but it had aged poorly, just like the man inside it. The paint was peeling, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. Their relationship was like the house, once solid, now neglected and decaying. They spoke a few times a year, on holidays and birthdays, their conversations brief, encircling the same empty topics, always careful to avoid the one subject that defined them. James found his father on the back porch, staring into the tangled yard with a bottle of beer in his hand. He looked up as James approached, his expression more annoyed than surprised. "What do you want?" Donald grunted. It was his standard greeting. James didn't waste time with small talk. He pulled out his phone and showed his father the picture the detective had sent him, the mud-stained ID badge, his mother's smiling face looking out from behind the plastic. "The police found this today," James said, his voice steady, "in a storm drain downtown." Donald squinted at the screen. James watched him closely, looking for a flicker of grief, of shock, of anything. What he saw was a flash of pure, undiluted anger. Donald pushed the phone away. "So what? Probably fell out of her purse years ago." "What are they bothering you for?" "It was found miles from the lake, Dad. It doesn't make any sense." "Nothing about that time makes sense," Donald snapped, turning away. "Why are you digging this up? It's been 20 years. Let her rest." The words were meant to sound final, like a command from a grieving husband. But to James, they sounded like a threat. The defensiveness was a wall his father had thrown up instantly, a reflex honed by years of practice. It was the same wall he had put up with the police, with concerned neighbors, with James himself. But for the first time, James saw not a wall of grief, but a wall of fear. He left without another word, his father's hostile dismissal echoing in his ears. It wasn't a confirmation, but it was enough. His father was hiding something. The next day, James went to St. Mary's General, the hospital where his mother had been a dedicated nurse. He didn't know what he was looking for, but it felt like the only other place to start. The hospital had changed over 2 decades, but he hoped some remnant of her time there remained. After hours of navigating a bureaucratic maze, explaining his situation to a half-dozen skeptical administrators, he was finally led to a dusty basement archive. A clerk pointed him to a row of metal cabinets filled with old microfiche and boxes of paper files. "Employee records from the 90s are in here," she said, before leaving him alone in the dim light. He spent hours scrolling through tiny, backlit text and sifting through brittle paper, the smell of old files filling his lungs. He found her employee reviews, all glowing. He found her vacation requests, including the one for that final trip to Pinecrest Lake. It was all so normal, so mundane. He was about to give up when he found a different kind of file tucked away in a box labeled Internal Complaints. And there it was, a formal harassment complaint filed by Jean Sanders. The date was just 1 week before she disappeared. He read the report, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The complaint was against a patient named Stephen. Jean described him as becoming increasingly obsessive, waiting for her after her shifts, sending unwanted gifts, making comments that made her deeply uncomfortable. The final paragraph detailed a threat. Stephen had told her that if he couldn't have her, no one could. James read the name over and over. Stephen. He had never heard that name before. His father had never mentioned it. The police report from 1992 had made no mention of a patient. This was it. This was the twist. He wasn't just chasing the ghost of a family argument anymore. He was on the trail of a man who had threatened his mother's life just days before she vanished. A new theory began to form in his mind, one that almost made sense. Maybe his father's anger wasn't guilt over killing her, but guilt over failing to protect her. Maybe he knew about this man, and that was the secret he had been hiding all along. With a renewed sense of purpose, James took a copy of the complaint to Detective Donna. She listened patiently as he laid out his theory. She agreed it was a significant lead that had been completely overlooked in the original investigation. "We'll find him," she promised. It took them a week. They discovered that Stephen had been in and out of institutions for years following his mother's disappearance, with a history of stalking and violent outbursts. His trail was messy, but the detective was persistent. They finally located him in a state-run nursing home 2 hours away. He was now a frail, withered man in his late 70s, his eyes cloudy with age and medication. James and the detective sat across from him in a sterile, sunlit room. James's hands trembled slightly as he placed a photo of his mother on the table between them. "Do you remember her?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. Stephen stared at the photo for a long time. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "The nurse," he rasped, his voice thin and papery. "She was kind." Detective Donna took over the questioning, gently but firmly guiding him back 2 decades. "We know you had feelings for her, Stephen. We know you were upset when she asked you to leave her alone." Stephen nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "She was an angel. I just wanted to be near her." "Did you follow her?" James interjected, unable to hold back. "Did you follow her to Pinecrest Lake?" The old man's eyes met James's. There was no malice in them, only a deep, ancient sadness. "Yes," he confessed, the word barely a whisper. "I saw in her file she was going on vacation. I just wanted to talk to her again, to apologize." He described following their green station wagon up the winding mountain road, watching them set up their tent from a distance. He waited until he saw Jean walk down to the lakeshore by herself. "I just went to talk to her," he repeated, his voice pleading. "She was scared when she saw me. We argued. I told her I was sorry, that I'd leave her alone forever. That's all that happened, I swear." "What happened next?" Detective Donna pressed. Stephen's face crumpled. "He came," he whispered, a new terror entering his eyes. "Her husband. He came out of the trees and he was like an animal." He screamed at her, "Who is this?" He didn't even look at me. He just looked at her with so much hate. The old man began to tremble. He grabbed her arm. I got scared. I ran. I just ran back to my car. As I was running, I heard her scream. Just once. James felt the air leave his lungs. It was all wrong. The story he had built, the one where his father was a broken man guilty of inaction, shattered into a million pieces. The truth was infinitely worse. His father's rage hadn't been about protecting her. It had been about possessing her. He stood up, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "Thank you," he said to the old man, who was now weeping silently. He walked out of the nursing home and into the bright afternoon, but all he could see was darkness. He finally understood. His father hadn't just lied. He had crafted a masterpiece of deception. And the ID badge wasn't a random clue. It was a calculated move. A piece of the puzzle deliberately placed on the wrong side of the board to send everyone looking in the wrong direction, away from the lake, away from the woods, and away from him. He drove straight to his father's house, a cold fury settling in his gut. The old green station wagon was still parked in the backyard, a decaying monument to the last day of his mother's life, covered by a gray, cracking tarp. His father wasn't home. James pulled back the tarp. The car was unlocked. He opened the rear hatch and climbed inside. The air was stale with the smell of old vinyl and something else, something like decay. He ran his hands over every inch of the cargo area, knocking on the panels, searching for anything out of place. His fingers caught on a slight ridge in the floor mat near the wheel well. He pulled it back and saw it, a thin seam in the metal floorboard that wasn't factory-made. Using a tire iron from the side compartment, he pried it open. Inside the small hidden space was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. With trembling hands, he lifted it out. It was a journal. His mother's journal. He opened it to the last entry. The handwriting was rushed, frantic. It was dated the morning they left for the lake. "Donald was up all night, just watching me. He saw the complaint I filed at the hospital. He thinks I'm seeing someone else. He said this trip is our last chance to fix things, but the way he said it, it wasn't a promise. It was a threat. I'm scared. I don't want to go." James closed the journal, the words burning in his mind. Just then he heard the sound of his father's truck pulling into the driveway. Donald walked around the back of the house and froze when he saw James standing by the open station wagon, the journal in his hand. The color drained from his father's face. All the anger, all the bluster from their last encounter was gone, replaced by the hollow look of a man who knew the game was over. "You shouldn't have done that," Donald said, his voice quiet. "I did it for you, you know, to protect you. She was going to leave us." James just stared at him, at the man who had stolen his mother and then stolen his childhood with a single, devastating lie. "No," James said, his voice shaking with the weight of 20 years of grief and rage. "You did it for you." He had already called the detective on his way over. As they stood there in the dying light, the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, a final, long overdue reckoning finally arriving at the door. When the police searched the woods near Pinecrest Lake, they found his mother's remains buried in a shallow grave, exactly where Donald finally told them to look. He had killed her in a fit of jealous rage, buried her, and then driven back to the city that night, a man on a mission. He had tossed her ID badge down a storm drain in a forgotten part of the city, a single piece of misdirection to ensure that if anything ever surfaced, it would point anywhere but at him. James held a service for her by the lake. He stood by the water's edge, the same spot where she had spent her final moments, and for the first time, he grieved not for the woman who had left, but for the woman who had been taken. The truth hadn't brought him the simple peace he had hoped for, but it had brought him something else. Clarity. He was no longer the boy haunted by a question mark. He was the son who had finally found the answer. If you were James, could you ever forgive a parent for a deception that profound, even if it was meant to protect you from a horrific truth? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who appreciates a mystery that time couldn't bury.